6 o'clock, and I would like to welcome you all to this seminar, How Change Happens. My name is Anna Sjöberg-Tebblin, and I am the kanslichef, whatever that is in English, here at FUF. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Duncan Green to our small office in the famous FUF-fåtöljen. And Karin Metell Cueva will moderate this seminar, so I will hand over the mic to her, but I will just like to remind you all that we are live streaming this event. So if you have questions, please speak into the microphone. Welcome.
Thank you, and nice to see so many people here in the crowded room. We're going to have a presentation by Duncan for about 30-40 minutes, I think. And then Helena has prepared some comments, Helena Bjuremalm from International IDEA. And then we will open up for an interesting discussion. So think about what questions you would like to raise, and we'll have time for that in the end. Without further ado, I leave you the mic.
I think I've got a mic.
Yeah, you have. Okay.
Is that fine?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can't sit there and talk. I'm sorry. I might just go. I need a guitar. So I'm going to make a little bit of room here and stand up and get out of the way of PowerPoint. Thank you, Karin. Thank you for the invitation. Stefan was saying there's about 700 years of experience of AIDS and development in the room, so I'm now feeling thoroughly terrified. I think one of the reactions I would expect and would be quite happy to discuss is this just a return to the 1970s, 1980s, or have we learned anything in between? Is it circular or is it a spiral? Yeah, but we can get to that. But first you have to endure my presentation. I'm sorry. At least you will if I can make a... Yeah, okay, so the book has the kind of title that destroys academic careers. You know. And luckily I don't have an academic career, so it's okay. How Change Happens. I was trying to work out when did I start thinking about change as a thing, separate from particular episodes. And one of the moments, I think, when light bulbs went off in my head about this was in India about 10 years ago. I went to this community in Tikamgarh, a community of lower caste fishermen, fishing people, fishing communities. It's one of those difficult ones to be politically correct about. Sort of lower caste communities who are fishing artificial lakes and have been for centuries. And I went there because I'd been told that there was a very interesting story of struggle and change there. It's in Madhya Pradesh, for those who know India. It's right, I'm just going to have a swig of my beer while you come in. Very nice. This is how all talks should be, I think. And about 25 years ago, someone discovered that these traditional ponds could be made far more productive by seeding them with baby fish, with fish eggs or fish fry. And yields went up, and it was a disaster. Because the first thing that happened was that upper caste people saw the money, and they came in and drove off all the lower caste people. Okay? So the lower caste people, most of them just accepted that this was what life is like if you're a lower caste fisherman in India. 12 young men actually protested and got beaten up. The beating up by thugs hired by the upper caste people triggered a wave of protest in the communities, and they said, you can't treat our boys like that, and there was a big social mobilization. So the social mobilization would have probably not got anywhere, except that they found a crucial figure, a Brahmin who'd set up his own NGI, non-governmental individual. He'd set up his own organization, having left the Indian civil service. And because he was a Brahmin, he could get these fishermen into rooms which they would normally be shut out of. So he got them in to talk to the police chief, who took a legal case, and the fishing communities were amazed. They'd never had a useful conversation with the Indian police service before. He got them in to talk to the state fishing minister, and the fishing minister adopted their cause, and things started to shift. When I got there in 2006, they'd recovered about 100 ponds, and they were campaigning for more. I went back again last year, and found that things had progressed in very interesting ways in the 10 years since I went in 2006. they have more ponds. So the number of ponds now under community control is 250. They've had demonstrations with 250,000 people. This is a big social movement. Even by Indian standards, it's substantial. They had a whole new set of problems in that drought is affecting the area, and the struggle now is for the dried up ponds, which are not covered by the new law on fishing communities. So now there's a new struggle with new landlords about who gets to farm the dry pond beds, which are very fertile. There's been a really interesting shift in norms. So I was in a mixed meeting, and at one point, for the first time in my life, probably the only time in my life, I actually ended up saying, could the women please be quiet? I want to hear what the men have to say. Which was, and I didn't even realise what I was saying until I'd said it, and I thought, wow, something's really changed here. But not all the norms have changed. So the norm around women's subordination really seems to have changed. But while I was there with the Brahmin from 10 years ago, he came this time too, people were coming up and touching his feet out of respect, right? So that norm isn't deeply rooted caste identity is still there. But something's changed around social mobilisation, and they said, we don't need him, we respect him, but we don't need him anymore. We talk directly to the people in power, the politicians, and we're well organised now. So very interesting sort of example. So in terms of what I took from that in terms of thinking about change, it was how technology change disrupts political and social systems. Yeah, and that first, the increase in yields, how protest and violence is sometimes a trigger for change. Difficult for an organisation like Oxfam, which is pacifist to its bones, to accept that violence can be good or can be productive. The importance of allies, that without that bridging role of the Brahmin, they may well never have got anywhere. So the construction of alliances with different groups, really important. And then how slow but how important norm change is. Just some of the things I took from that one study. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those ideas, and I'll focus on two aspects of the book, basically the beginning and the end. I'll spare you all the bit in the middle. So the beginning of the book is all about how thinking in terms of systems and power changes what we do. And then the last bit of the book is on the so what's, the elusive search for doing something differently rather than just reading an interesting book and then carry on doing the same thing. The cake, okay? To make a cake, you need a recipe, you need ingredients, and you need an oven. If you have the recipe, you have the ingredients, and the oven works, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you are in history, you will predictably produce a cake. And if you get the cake, you can attribute that cake to the fact that you followed the recipe. The project. Okay? This is the core artifact of the aid business, is that we will do something, we predict what we will achieve, and we will do monitoring and evaluation so that if we achieve it, we can say it's because we did our project. And then we will go back for more money. And on we go. All right? Now, there are circumstances in which the project is a good idea. I'll come to that at the end. But there are many circumstances in which it is a poor match for reality. You can't really see this, but there's lots of stakeholders, and there's lots of arrows linking them. And this is a stakeholder map by the US, done for the US military in Afghanistan in the mid-2000s. And when it was leaked, everybody laughed at it, and I looked at it and I thought, I wish our Afghan team had anything like that subtle an understanding of the Afghan political system and social system. The point about this diagram is that it's a complex system, and a complex system is different from a complicated system. In a complex system, there are so many connections, so many feedback loops, that if you intervene, you poke the system with a lot of aid or a lot of soldiers, effects will ripple through, everything affects everything else, everything reacts to different to the actions of everybody else, and you cannot predict what will happen next. It is very unpredictable when you intervene in that system, and if change happens, which it happens all the time, attribution is very difficult. You cannot say why something has changed. You can have a good guess, but you can't be certain. And this is like our lives, you know. I mean, our lives are not predictable, and when change happens, who knows why, you know. I mean, we always take the credit, obviously, if it's a good change, but that's usually accident and other things play a big role. But we're going into these situations in many circumstances as aid workers with the cake as our tool. And we're looking for linear bits we can intervene in, bits which are predictable. You know, maybe if we just vaccinate some kids, we can reduce, we can improve health indices, then we can just ignore the rest, you know, fingers crossed. So that's the kind of problem, I think, of the cake model in these situations. And what the book argues is that there are other ways to work in these complex systems which are more effective. Let's see if I can convince this audience. If I can convince this audience, I think I can convince anyone. So let's think about one aspect, the dynamics of change in these situations. So the dynamics of change in complex systems are what scientists call phase changes. So they go along, and then boom, everything, and then another spike. So it's not that smooth change which is actually underpins a lot of our projects. Okay, our projects say we're going to do this in year 1, this in year 2, this in year 3. What if halfway through year 2, the whole thing explodes? Right? At which point there are sudden new opportunities for change. The Arab Spring, the global financial crisis, the Paris Declaration on climate change. Big, unexpected opportunities emerge. So the first thing is, how do you work around critical junctures? If those are the moments when change is possible and you're trying to bring about change, some changes are predictable, the known unknowns. You know that elections are really important, those moments of change. You know that if you're working on Zimbabwe, at some point, Robert Mugabe is going to die. Okay, we have to cling to that hope. So how do you prepare for that? But then lots of them are unknown unknowns. So no one predicted the global financial crisis, although everybody claimed to afterwards. So how do you respond to something like that? A really massive event, a war, a conflict. So if you're serious about change, you have to think about whether you're designed to respond to critical junctures. I think another point is path dependence. That Afghan map is the same in any organisation. I expect Sida would look something similar in terms of the map. If every situation is context specific, what is the role of best practice? What is the role of guidelines, frameworks, toolkits? Are they useless? Or how do we adapt them? How profoundly do they need to be adapted to a different context when we go from one place to another? So the book argues that we need a new approach, and I'll sort of talk a bit about that new approach. The other thing I got very excited about when I was reading about the book, for the book, was the whole issue of power. Now, for those of you who missed the Matrix film, it is a most enjoyable adolescent angst movie from the early 2000s, I think. There's a moment in it when the hero sees the matrix behind reality. Reality turns out to be false, and it's a bunch of ones and zeros being run by some aliens. Okay, and there are moments when you read and think about power that power starts to feel like the matrix. Power is the matrix of development. Power is the distribution of power is what determines outcomes in development speak, and the redistribution of power is what happens when serious change happens. So what I'm arguing here is that if we can make the power visible, like the matrix, sorry, I'll labour the comparison, making the power visible is a really useful starting point in trying to understand how change could happen or how change is happening. And there are lots of different ways to make the power visible in a different situation. Lots of academic writings, lots of tools. The simplest tool that I've ever come across is from a hero of mine, Robert Chambers from IDS, who says in any discussion, in any conversation, in any interaction, at some point you should ask yourself, who is the upper and who is the lower? Because that's going to shape what is said, what is not said, what is done, what is listened to. So really useful heuristic in terms of rule of thumb when you're in conversations. Slightly more subtle one from Jo Rowlands, who's a colleague at Oxfam, who wrote a really interesting book on women's empowerment in Honduras. And she distinguished between lots of different kinds of power. So power within, which is often neglected, which is the moment when people who are traditionally subordinated, like those fishing communities in Tikamgar, the moment when they say, actually, no, basta, I'm not taking this any longer. And they protest, or they organise, or they do something. And the thing that triggers those light bulb moments is hugely varying. So sometimes it's a priest or an imam, sometimes it's a family member, a role model, sometimes it's a moment. Often it's, you know, in my experience in Latin America, it's a moment of repression can do that. It can be reading something. I once met an indigenous activist in Bolivia who said, the thing that changed my life was reading ILO Convention 169. Yeah. Not a common conversation, it has to be said, which is why I still remember it. It's like, wow, you are a geek. But he had read this ILO Convention on Indigenous rights, and he said, when I read that, the Indigenous part of me woke up. And he's out there organising, you know, as an Indigenous activist because of that. So different things trigger these moments. When they happen, people look around and they see people in similar situations, and they start to link up, start to organise power with. And an example I like to give, but I still haven't finished investigating it, of what happens when power with kicks off. We have this very nice project in Nepal called Women's Discussion Classes. Okay, it sounds like jam and flower arranging. It sounds really nice, you know. And the idea is women who are stuck in their houses come to a safe place. They choose topics. The NGO we're working with brings in speakers, and it's all great. Right? It's the Women's Institute for Nepal. Within a couple of months, they were planning how to burn down the alcohol stalls in their villages and smash up the gambling dens, right? This was not in the plan. The reason why I'm still investigating it is because the people involved won't tell me what happened. I think they think I'm some kind of an investigator from HQ. I just want to know, but I'm Skyping them next week because I said, look, I really want to know how this ended. I know the police got involved at some point, and I just want to know what happened. But what that shows is that when this power with process kicks off, you know, anything can happen. And that's what's so exciting about the development business, as I'm sure you've all experienced. Then the other forms that Joe talks about, power to influence decision-making and power over the decision-making apparatus sometimes. Yeah. So just, it's not linear, it's not sequential, but it's one way to disaggregate power. There are lots of others. We use it. This is not just a theoretical thing. This is an example of how we use power analysis, and we use it at all levels. So we do lots of power analysis when we're doing a global climate change campaign. This is an example from a village in Tajikistan. We'd spent a couple of days with our Tajik staff, Oxfam staff, and some partners down in some villages, looking at water and sanitation in Tajikistan, which is dire. Tajikistan's a miserable country. It's the worst bit of the Soviet Union left over, you know. And when we got back to the office, we got out the flip charts, because that's what NGOs do. And we said, so who were the power holders? Who were the stakeholders in the villages? And the staff initially said, there's the state and there's the people, right, which is the classic activist binary. Yeah? There's the state, and the people demand things from the state, and the state have a duty to, which I'm deeply dubious about as a way of seeing the world. But anyway, then we said, okay, well, let's go into more detail, unpack that, get underneath that. And they started talking about all the other people who matter in the village. So the teacher and the nurse are seen as respected as educated people. They can help you fill in forms, they can advise you on dealing with bureaucracy. The truck driver's a really well-connected individual, brings in the news from all the other villages. So as a kind of node, a sort of communications node, so people go to him when they want to know what's going on in the world. The mayor, clearly important decision-making person, but if the mayor's not very helpful, the mayor's lover was a really important way in, because apparently, you know, pillow talk. If you can influence the mayor's lover, you're going to go straight through to the mayor. That's good. And so it went. And the imam, not just a religious leader, but also if people have bad dreams, they go to the imam for interpretation. So very influential in terms of people's understanding of their own situations. So they created a mini Afghan map, a system. And then we said, okay, so we're talking about water and sanitation. So put them on this 2x2. This axis, the x-axis, is how much do these individuals care about water and sanitation, and this axis is how influential are they. If they care but they're not influential, then and you're trying to get water and sanitation sort of addressed, then you're thinking, okay, so how can we help them organise? How can we put them in touch with the equivalent of the Brahmin? Who's the intermediary they need to really have more influence? You're trying to get them up. The ones on the top left are the ones who are influential but don't care about water and sanitation. So then the default position in academia and probably in the aid business is let's write another paper. Yeah, that should do it. Which does work sometimes, but is not generally the obvious candidate for influential people who are not interested in your topic. What might be better is to actually take them to see some really bad water and sanitation experiences. They may just not know. Get them to talk to somebody they respect. So the best way to influence the CEO of a company is not to produce a paper, is to get them to talk to a CEO of another company, because they believe them, right? So there's that talking with peers, or people they fear. Yeah, that always helps too. So people they are scared of, tell them to do something, they will at least pretend to do it. So there's sort of different ways to get them across to the top right. And basically you're trying to get as many people up into the top right, because that's when things happen. Now that's very reductionist, very crude, and very useful. And we do it in lots of different situations. So I think it's certainly worth thinking about. I'm sure there's lots of weaknesses with it, but I think it's worth looking at. Now, I'm having a beer and I'm more relaxed, so I'm probably going to overrun. So I'm relying on you to, okay, fine, good. I somehow feel less pressured than I did feel at lunchtime. I've got two key guinea pigs who I test things on, my lab rats. These are my sons, okay? So one son is a community organizer, and he's much better at activism than I am. And the other son is a researcher, and he's much better at research than I am. So it's brilliant. I can test anything on them. So I tested the book on them, and the community organizer said, this is fine, but you've got to boil it down to 2 slides, because that's how community organizers think. And unless you can do it on 2 slides, I will never remember it when I'm at a crucial point in my struggle of whatever he's struggling on at the time. So I said, okay, but I'm against blueprints and toolkits. So I had this kind of difficult thing where I had to push it into the sausage machine and get something out at the end, which was not a toolkit. So what I've come up with is an approach, okay? And the approach is saying, okay, this is the kind of way you need to be to work effectively in complex systems and the kinds of questions you need to ask, but absolutely not going to say what sort of answers you should be looking for, because that depends on the context, which is about as, it's about as good as I could manage in terms of squaring that particular circle. So the way we need to think and feel, and I don't know about Sida, but I think in the UK aid and development sector, we are not like this, okay? Curiosity, if you're in that Afghan map, it's changing all the time, you have to then have a genuine, deep felt and honest curiosity about what's going on. In the NGOs, those conversations are always in the restaurant at the end of the day. It's when you spend your day on the log frame or on the indicators or whatever else, you go to the restaurant and people say, oh, did you see what that politician's got up to? Or do you see those people, they're protesting, what are they about? And that's the bit you need to bring into the office conversation, because that's actually the important bit. That's the intel which will tell you how the system's changing and what new opportunities are arising. I was in Myanmar in September, and we were sitting in a restaurant. That's what NGOs spend a lot of time doing. And we were having a typical Myanmar conversation. So the military, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, civil society and the media, right? Jolly good. Having a little conversation about the interactions. And then someone said, what about those funerals? There was an academic there, and the incentive system of academics is if you hear something new, grab it and write a paper about it, and it'll make your career. So Anu, this academic friend of mine from IDS, where Robert Chambers comes from, said, funerals? What's all that about? If she hadn't been there, we'd have probably just gone back to our boring conversation about the standard players. But because she asked, we found out that there's a new social movement sprung up from nowhere in Myanmar around the cost of burials, which is traditionally, in Europe certainly, a big driver of social change. People get, it's such a big shock when someone dies and you have to pay a huge amount for a decent burial that it's become a source of social organisation. Anna's really happy because she's now writing a paper about the burial movement in Myanmar, and we've got a whole new thing to look at in terms of social change because we had someone there who was curious. And I worry that there's not many, a lot of those conversations escape us. We miss things because we're not genuinely curious. Humility. Now this is not false humility, it's not, are people on Twitter? There's a thing called humble bragging. which is, if you want to know what humble bragging is, follow Yanis Varoufakis on Twitter, who is the former Greek foreign minister. He is like Olympic standard humble bragger. Things like, humbled by 500 people coming to hear me tonight, you know. Yeah, right. So this is not that sort of humility, okay? This is evidence-based humility. This is if you're in that Afghan situation, you really don't know what's happening or what's going to happen. And that's really difficult if you're an activist, whether you're in Sida or in an NGO or wherever you are, because part of being the dynamism of activism is certainty, confidence, and being willing to do scary things, saying something to someone who's much older, more experienced, or more powerful than you, saying something which people don't want to hear, you know, going up against people in conversations or in debates, and to do that at the same time as knowing in your heart and at the back of your mind that what you're saying might well be wrong, and that you might think something different next week. It's a really difficult cognitive dissonance to manage. And I think it's probably the hardest thing that the book says in terms of what's practically useful to people. But when you think about it, what are the alternatives? Right? You manage that cognitive dissonance, or you say, no, I'm absolutely sure I'm right, and I'm just going to keep going. Or, I've absolutely no idea what to do. I'm totally traumatized, and yeah, I see both sides of every question, and I'm just going to write lots of papers, which is kind of my job description, roughly. So the activist has to be in the middle of that, however uncomfortable it is. And there's some wonderful books about working with ambiguity, about how you embrace ambiguity and turn it into a creative force, because you really have no choice. Reflexivity, conscious of your own power, the Robert Chambers upper and lower, and multiple perspectives. I really worry that the aid business prefers monocultures, and in systems terms, monocultures are not good. They're prone to attack by pests. They are brittle. They don't change or innovate, and yet we create political and social monocultures. Oxfam prefers to fund people who talk our language, people who have nice websites, people who understand our forms, and that's, yeah, people who understand our forms is a tiny subset of humanity. And it doesn't include me, I think. And that means that you get a network of organizations which are all very similar. And I think that's, yeah, okay, this is stretching the argument a bit, but I would argue that one of the reasons why civil society is under such attack in many countries is that we have turned it into something that looks alien. That we've turned it in by funding organizations that look like us, by making them talk like us, they end up looking foreign. And it becomes much easier to then say these are foreign agents and we're going to start cracking down on them. So I think there's a real danger in monoculture. It's all right, I'm getting to the end.
Continue.
Okay, I will. I'll try. Anyway, if you go back to the Egyptian revolution and you think about who was in Tahrir Square, who was actually defending the protesters against the police in Tahrir Square in Cairo, it was principally two organizations. It was the Muslim Brotherhood and it was the football club supporters, because in Egypt, the football club supporters are terrifying. Okay? They spend their time fighting and they're very well organized, and they came together to defend the protesters in Tahrir Square. Now, would Sida consider either the Muslim Brotherhood or the football club supporters as natural partners? I have my doubts. Right? And yet, the new Swedish development policy is all about we work with civil society, we love civil society is great. Okay, but how widely do you define civil society? If you just define it as these boring middle-class CSOs, then you've just missed the whole of Tahrir Square. Right? So I think there's a real question there about diversity. I work for a boring middle-class NGO, and they're great, right? But there's more to life. Okay, I think we're getting to the end. You'll be pleased to hear. So this is the second bit. So the first bit is the kind of the way to be, and the second bit is the questions to ask. So, what kind of change are we talking about? Yeah, we love policy change, practice change, spending decisions, tangible things you can report on, you can measure, you can feel sure about. Because in the end, we're in this incredibly uncertain world, and you're looking for something to cling to. But actually, I think increasingly it's the norm shifts. It's the changes in the deep underlying views of what people are or should be that are really sometimes the biggest contribution of activism and external agents. If you look at how fast views have changed on the role of women, on whether children are belongings or individuals, on whether disabled people are people, on sexuality, huge churn over the last 20, 30 years with backlashes and setbacks, but amazing, and I think an accelerating sort of pace of change in terms of social norms. We know very little about how that happens. Yeah, it's amazingly under-researched. How social norm change happens, how much of that is deliberate, how much of it is about demographics and technology and a bunch of unintended drivers of change. It's a huge gap, and I wish we could be better at it. Most of what I've read has been on violence against women and women's rights. It would be great just to copy that across to some other topics, but there's far more that we don't know. Precedents. So two areas of precedent I think are really, could be really rich and could really help us be better at what we're trying to do. First is history. So, you know, Oxfam bangs on about inequality. We do those killer facts, we call them, for Davos every year. You know, this year it was 8 individuals have the same wealth as 3.6 billion poorest people in the world. All good. So what we're arguing for is redistribution. So isn't it interesting that 23 countries have actually done this in the last 50 years? We found 23 countries that have reduced their Gini index inequality by a substantial amount over a 10-year period or more. No one, no NGO, no academic, nobody has done a comparative study of those 23 countries. Yeah, there is this extraordinary historical amnesia. People aren't interested in history, which is just bizarre. But the other precedent is actually current. So a really interesting approach pioneered by some Save the Children people called Jerry and Monique Sternen in Vietnam, and now turned into a whole approach called the positive deviance approach, which is I love because what it starts from is that in many situations when you have a problem, the system will throw up some solutions, partial solutions, maybe even complete solutions. So the starting point of positive deviance is we're going to look at the system. It's never a spike, there's always a distribution on whatever issue you're looking at, and we're going to identify the positive outliers and try and understand them. The Sterling started in Vietnam with malnutrition, and they did a fantastic process which reduced malnutrition in a period of months in villages just by looking at why the kids who were least malnourished, and then spreading that knowledge amongst the communities. Didn't involve a project, didn't involve us coming in with toolkits or anything, it was go and look. And they've done it on everything from superbugs in American hospitals to FGM in Egypt. And it's a really interesting approach. And we don't use it much. I think it's because it doesn't easily lend itself to projects, to being projectized. Power I talked about. And then the current craze in development, in the aid, in aid, different thing, is adaptive management. So I was at a meeting of USAID in December, where they got 200 of their implementing partners, the really big money management consultant type people in the room, and they said, you will be adaptive, right? Which was kind of odd, didn't feel quite right, but, and that means that when you report to us, we will want to hear what you've changed during the course of your project. And if you say it's all gone to plan, that's actually a black mark against you, because that suggests you weren't looking. Really interesting. Yeah, that is a huge shift in terms of what USAID, how USAID relates to the people who are. And one of the best suggestions was we need a hotline so that when one of your junior people says we have to stick with the indicators, we can phone up and say, you got to deal with this person. So it got very interesting in terms of how this change could happen within the aid business. Okay, have I got time for a couple of 2x2s?
Yes.
Okay. I increasingly think in terms of 2x2s, which really annoys my more intelligent friends. I like them because they make you think about things you haven't thought about. They raise new. They're not a definitive description of the world and all its possibilities. They're just have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So here are two I've used and I really like. So the first is from Rao and Keller, who've done decades of really interesting work on gender rights, women's empowerment. The y-axis is the change you're talking about at an individual level or at a societal level? Is it a systemic change? And the x-axis is it a formal, institutional sort of question, or is it something informal going on inside people's heads? And Rao and Keller argue that we've really neglected the left-hand side. So if it's individual and formal, then you're talking about resources, credit, livelihoods, a very traditional aid quadrant. If you're talking formal and systemic, it's laws, policies, advocacy, diplomacy. That's all fairly familiar. On the other side, if it's individual and informal, those are the light bulb moments: consciousness, capabilities, empowerment in that sort of personal sense. And if it's lower down, then it's the social norms thing. Now, Rao and Keller say it's not. Most change processes move between them, move between quadrants. So it's not that you have to choose your quadrant, but you have to think about whether the process is split across more than one quadrant and how it's moving between them. Because often something that, in the example I gave in Tikamgar, it started off with lower caste people getting a sense of empowerment and we won't accept this. It moved very rapidly. It's worth thinking about this as a whole. The other one came up in a seminar, really good seminar with USAID and DFID, where our homework was to come up with a 2x2 of some kind, I think. And I like this one because it's got a place for log frames. It means that log frames can carry on, which I think is important. Right? So on the x-axis, it's how well do you understand the context, the place you're in, the issue you're working on. And on the y-axis, how confident are you about the proposed intervention? Is this something you've been doing for 30 years, you know it inside out, you've tried every variation, or is it a bit of a risk, a bit of an experiment? If you're confident on the intervention and you know the place, you know the context, then you're in log frame country, linear planning with good feedback. Make a cake because you're pretty sure of what you're doing. The mistake is in thinking that everything's in that quadrant. So let's look at the other quadrants. And here I think we're better above the line and less going on below the line. So if you're confident on the intervention and you're not sure about the context, if you're doing cash transfers in Somalia and the rebels attack, people run away, you don't say, damn, I'm going to have to try something else. Cash transfers obviously don't work. You think, we need to move the cash transfers to where the people have gone. So it's fast feedback and response. And that's what a lot of the adaptive management thing is talking about now. So I think we're covered above the line. Below the line, if you're not confident on the intervention, but you kind of know the country, you're just not sure what to try, there's a really obvious thing which almost never happens, which is, well, try 10 things at once. Try 10 different parallel experiments and see which one works. There was this great example in Tanzania where DFID came to Oxfam and said, nothing's working on accountability, have $1 million. Try something new. All right? And it was a complete lesson in itself. The first thing that happened was the Oxfam computer said no. Right? The Oxfam computer said, well, I need your KPIs. I'm sorry, where's the log frame? So we couldn't take DFID's money for months. Right? So we eventually beat the computer and forced it to accept the money. And then a brilliant project officer came up with, we don't know what to do, so let's just try 8 things at once for 9 months. And we had, it was about accountability. So we had strolling musicians, a radio show, school management councils, farm animators talking to other farmers, all sorts of different things we tried. And then after 9 months, we said in advance we were going to sit down with communities, consultants and partners and decide which ones were working best and which ones were not. And we were going to scale up the good ones and try some different things within them. DFID didn't like the look of this. So they said, whoa, we don't like your theory of change, which is always bad news when someone says that to you, because no one knows what it means. Right? So I went over there and spent some time looking at this project and realized that she'd kind of accidentally reinvented evolution, right? Because this is variation, selection, amplification. We were deliberately varying in order to select and then amplify the good ones. So we went back into battle with DFID. They had the sort of theory of change guy, a Norwegian, and we went into battle, and he said, oh, don't like your theory of change, very high failure rates, not good. And I said, but this is evolution. And he went, what? And then eventually I said, this is actually a venture capitalist model of change. At which point they went, oh, and we got another $1 million, right? Because it's private sector, ooh. But it was venture capitalist, because that's what venture capitalists do. They try lots of different startups, they fund lots of different startups, and 1 or 2 of them are going to do really well. So A, dress everything up in private sector language if you're talking to the British government, and B, listen to Darwin, he knows a thing or two, you know. But no one does it, and that's really interesting. Is it the high failure rates? What is it about this that is so unattractive to the aid business. And then this one, if you don't know where you are and you don't know what you're doing, welcome to my world. And that's where the positive deviance stuff works. So the people who wrote the book, The Power of Positive Deviance, say we never get invited until everything else has been tried and failed, and then people send for us. And that's that quadrant. And one example from Egypt, they were trying to deal with female genital mutilation in Egypt. 97% of women were being cut. Nothing was changing. They bring in the positive deviance team, and the positive deviance team say, 3%. That's interesting. They flip it, and they then build a whole thing around talking to the women who had not been cut and trying to establish why that was, and a whole new process. And it was kind of shed light on what was going on in Egypt and how things might change. So a brilliant sort of way of rethinking and looking in a different way at the system. I think I'm there. Yes. Thanks.
Sit back and relax in your chair.
With my beer. This is great.
Thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure there will be questions from the audience and comments. But first, I'll give the floor to Helena.
Thank you very much, Karin. I'll make some few comments first, and then I have 3 questions, and I'll try to be nice. Well, actually, I'll be very nice. That tends to work best. In case somebody here hasn't yet read a book, I can really recommend it, because it's one of those rare books that manages to capture several levels at once. It talks about global levels, the national level, the local, and the grassroots levels. It also manages to touch upon a great diversity of actors, ranging from, I think you ended talking about the venture capitalist, but you also talk about grassroots activists in Bolivia and women, a lot of women communities in India going berserk. I'm sure they had good reasons for that. You also talk about a great number of perspectives. My checkbook is usually to see, like, are political parties mentioned? Because political parties tend not to be mentioned in this type of literature, but they were, so I was very happy about that. You also talk about different dimensions of power. You problematize power into, I'm very glad to also hear that you've been inspired by IDS. I'm sure you're familiar with the power cube, which is a very good analytical tool. So, I mean, just to sum that part up, it's rather rare that a book manages to sort of swing itself between all these levels and perspectives at one go. I also very much like that you went for open access. I think that's great for if there are any students here. Oh, that's true. But I think it's actually a good sales argument. There's a dedicated website. I think there are podcasts being planned. Maybe even a massive open online course. I call them MOOCs or something. It's a strange acronym. And even a master's module. I think maybe that's a great model for if anybody in here is thinking about publishing something, I think that's something to copy. Then when it comes to just a few comments on the substance before moving into my questions. On the power and systems approach, I think that it's really important to stress that whichever approach you choose, and I think this comes across as a good one, it builds on a lot of experiences and knowledge, both in academia and policy literature and sort of good fit practice, but they still require a very solid knowledge base. I'd like to emphasize that, in particular in these sort of post-truth era, that there's no shortcut to knowledge. You need to spend the time learning the languages, understanding the power dynamics, understanding who's who, doing I think what you call in sociology, the Venn diagrams, who played football with whom, who goes to which bar, who hangs out with whom, who's afraid of whom, like you alluded to. Without that knowledge, there's no sense in even using the 2x2s that you sketched. I just want to emphasize that without that homework, you would still be lost. I very much agree with the list of sentiments that you listed about humility, reflexivity, curiosity, but I think courage would have been good to add to the list. Because for those activists within the struggle against sort of the dominant norms in their agencies or organizations, I think a lot of them might feel like they're swimming against a mudslide, and that requires a lot of courage to persist, barging ahead, even though everything is apparently going against you. Just a comment on the first 2x2, the one that was about individual and systemic change, and the informal and formal. Just a reflection. It might be easy to assume that we would all use it in the same way, but I think if you would have, let's say, a lawyer or an anthropologist or a political scientist or an economist or a philosopher or a sociologist or historian, they would all start in different boxes, and they will all end up in different boxes because we have completely different perspectives, underlying theoretical assumptions about what is change. Should something change? Is that a good thing? Maybe that's a bad thing. And what are the primary vehicles for that change? Is it laws that need to change, or is it your sort of innermost beliefs? I'll come back to that point in my questions, which I'll turn to now. I did praise you for covering like a lot of levels and actors, but one level that I was actually missing was the regional level. You talked about global, national, local, but there are a lot of things that are happening at the regional level. With regional economic communities, some of them have legislative powers. Some of them are actually quite active when it comes to, say, democratization and peacekeeping. If you think about ECOWAS recently, how they really intervened in Gambia to oust the president who refused to leave and support the newly elected president. The regional level tends also to be the first port of call for, say, activists that need to go under the radar for a while. They would go maybe for protection in the neighboring country where, like, say, there might be a network of human rights defenders rather than immediately to the global level. So I think that was a pity that global level, the regional level wasn't covered extensively. When it comes to actors, excuse me, it would have been beneficial, I think, to also talk a bit more about the role of parliaments, because at least those parliaments that are in parliamentary systems with proportional sort of representation rather than the first past the post electoral systems, they, at least in theory, not always in practice, but they can be an actor of change. They can monitor compliance with human rights norms, etc. And together with media, which you do cover, and of course civil society at various levels, and opposition parties and ruling parties, they can be part of an important strategic alliance. You did cover, again, on actors, venture capitalists, which I think is good. I mean, they're very scary in one sense, but I think there are also some, like you brought up, some things that you can maybe not learn, but at least look at. But I think it would have been beneficial if you had talked a little bit more about the owners of the companies. We tend to talk about the CEOs, but who actually owns the company? That could be a pension fund that we are saving in ourselves, which makes sort of the accountability chain sort of go full circle. Oh, is everything our fault? And what can we do as, you know, people who save up for our pensions in those pension funds? My second set of questions has to do with institutional culture, because there are several places in the book you talk about that there are so few ideas that are picked up, that are replicated or adapted in spite of being out there for us to learn from. And then you refer to, and no, the main barrier to that is institutional culture. It would be helpful if you could unpack that a little bit. Is that only about that the wrong people are recruited, that the incentives within the organizations are sort of faulty, or does it rather concern something that goes deeper than that? I'm not going to go into new public management because that will, I think, ignite a big, huge debate, but rather like deeply rooted Western paradigms that you can make plans and then things should happen their way, and if it doesn't, you will just redo it again. So it's like a deep, well, we can say what you think about, but it's just what you mean by institutional culture, how deep that goes. Last question is, there are a lot of we in the book. Of course, you can only be who you are. I mean, like you said, you were joking about yourself working for a middle class, in spite of a great organization, Oxfam. But I think it would be good if we could sort of switch the perspective into, how about if we would empower, well, now I said we, so I'm as guilty as you are, if we would empower partners to manage their own, I don't like the word theories of change, I think it really should be change management, so that they could draft a book about how they could change international non-governmental organizations or bilateral donors. And where would we fit in the 2x2 if they would do that analysis of us? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting comments and questions. I think I'll leave the mic to you before we open up. Yeah. Yeah.
Just ignore them. Really good. Really.
Yeah.
I'm on this one already.
You are.
So I think. Am I? Yes. So I think really great set of comments. Thank you. Your staff turnover is always going to be too high to achieve that. So what you should do is concentrate on the enabling environment, which is transparency, access to information, and then just, if something changes, great. If something doesn't, it's not, you're not God. That's just life. Now that's kind of, it's a bit of a cop-out in terms of it's a bit of a sort of retreat from engagement by Shanta and the people who agree with him at the World Bank, but it's also quite rational. So I'm sort of torn between those two views of, does complexity mean you do more or you do less? I think is worth thinking about. Absolutely on the regional one, I agree, it's becoming more and more important. Gap in the book. The stuff on political parties and parliaments is really interesting. I had to really look to find anything I could use. Yeah, you can find papers, but they don't say anything interesting. And I really struggled to find something good on these topics. And yeah, the book's weak on that. I just struggled. I mean, I talked to a few people, emailed everybody I knew, and there's critiques of very crude parliamentary strengthening and saying, we just got to make them look more like Sweden or more like Denmark, which is one view of parliamentary strengthening. But there's very little which actually looks at political party systems as they are, or parliamentary systems as they are. I would have loved to find something which says, well, parliamentary systems are mainly patronage vehicles, but they also achieve this, this, and this. Maybe it's just my not understanding of the literature or not getting the right literature, but it was very frustrating, I agree, and it shows. Ownership structures of companies is really interesting. Some students of mine at the LSE did this fantastic case study on when do companies intervene behind human rights. And they found that it was privately owned companies were more likely to be both good and bad, because they've got a sort of bigger spectrum of behaviours, because they don't have the checks and balances that are publicly owned, that the listed companies have. And I think we really should be thinking more about ownership structures of companies and how that shapes how they behave. I think, definitely. Then finally, who is we? Yeah, it's a question I always ask whenever anybody says we, and it's funny to have it done back to me, because there's all these, we must end poverty, we must do this by 2030 and all this stuff. We had a great discussion, an internal Oxfam discussion a couple of weeks back in Berlin, where I thought it would be really interesting to actually have all the people we fund draw up a league table of which of the 18 Oxfams they like and publish that every year. Hasn't been seized as a good idea quite yet, but I'm going to push it. I think that'd be really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you.
I told you I wasn't going to answer your questions.
I have a few questions myself, but I'll open up the floor for anyone who would like to comment or something or ask a question. Karin, you can say your name and...
Okay. My name is Karin Norberg, and I used to work at Sida once upon a time. I have also been director of a research institute. But I'm starting as a woman. As a woman, I think I have been thinking about change all my life. How do you change norms and make them more welcoming to women in the labor market, in the organization, everywhere? And it's something I've come to conclude that you have to work every day. It's nothing you can just say, well, now I have achieved it. It's like brushing your teeth. It's like, washing up. You must do it every day. You must think about it every day. You may not do things every day. So that's my starting point. And then I come back to we. Who are we and who are doing the changes? I think that Swedish aid policy has been for many, many years that you should create conditions for improvement or change, or sort of not do the change yourself, but trying to support. And I think your presentation here is very interesting, because it creates sort of an understanding about what powers are at play. And I was just wanted to ask you one thing. Have you ever done a change sort of test at Oxfam? If you want to do a change in an organization, how do you do it? This is what I tried to do once at Sida within my department. I said, well, if we are interested in change, but change is difficult, how do we do it? If we want to change our organization, how do we do it? So, a comment then on knowledge. I think that's extremely important, and this is what I think is also a problem in aid organizations, at least if I look at the Swedish one. There is never time to digest. There is an enormous amount of knowledge about many, many different things you have been talking about, but there is never time for people who are working with these things to digest this knowledge. And I think that's it's a challenge which I worked with, but it has increased over time, because you are talking about results, and you are creating extraordinary complicated systems to follow up results, but not or forgetting about that you need to feed in knowledge, because it's by having that analytical capacity that you can understand the different systems you have been talking about, and I understand is presented in your book. I haven't read it, so. And finally, a comment that Sida and DFID, I think, and other Nordic aid agencies supported a research project many years ago about social policy in a developmental context. And they looked at the Nordic countries to see how did they do the reduction of inequality in their countries? How did they work? And I think that's, it's a way to understand how change is actually taking place, at least at the national level. I mean, then you have, as I said, gender dimensions, you have other dimensions today when you have migration is complicating the picture, etc. So that was maybe not so much of a question, except for, have you ever done a change test at Oxfam? Thank you.
Okay. I particularly like changing noises like brushing your teeth. I'll probably steal that. That's good. Yeah, I've watched other people try to change Oxfam. The only way I can have influence in Oxfam, as far as I can work out, is to publish something on my blog which gets read by somebody at DFID and gets fed back to my bosses in Oxfam. Emails to my bosses at Oxfam don't get anywhere, right? But if they hear it from someone outside, then that works. But that's my own little, space. I think I've watched different attempts. So one attempt is you're all amazing English speakers, so I'm assuming you understand the phrase bull in a china shop. So we had a bull in a china shop who was going to make Oxfam work on climate change some years ago. And he just drove and drove and drove, and everybody hated him. It caused huge fights, and he won. Right, so Oxfam works on climate change, and he's happy because he's achieved his aim. A huge personal cost to him and to everybody around him, but he got it. Another person, and you won't be surprised to hear that it was a woman, puts out little ideas, just feeds them into the bloodstream. People can't quite work out who thought of it first. Maybe I thought of it first. Ooh, that's a good idea. And equally effective, actually. Then another person, you get an incredibly charismatic individual, Winnie Byanyima, our executive director of Oxfam International, who is a force of nature and a force of chaos. So she comes in, she starts things off, and everybody has to tidy up after her, but because it's Winnie, that's fine. So charisma really and leadership really matter. But then the other one is, get DFID to tell people to do it. So, and a funding crisis helps. Burning platform, critical junctures, institutional critical junctures. It always seems easier to change when there's a crisis than when things are going well. which is a real shame because actually it would be great if we could change when things are going well, but that doesn't seem to happen. So, but my aim in life is not to change Oxfam. I have to say, other people can try. I'm one of the few people in Oxfam who actually talks to anybody outside Oxfam, and I want to keep it that way. You know, yeah.
I'll ask a question myself, since I have the mic. Also, I love 2x2s. I think they are very helpful, and not this one, but the other one. I also read it in that USAID DFID report. I think this is very useful, and I've actually used it a lot, trying to explain to my colleagues when linear thinking fits and when adaptive management could be another way of trying things. But I have a question myself and a problem. If there isn't an easy fix to a problem, if the problem is wicked, as some people call it, Land Pritchett, and the definition of a wicked problem I've learned is something that you can't really solve, like youth unemployment or something that's, you know, it's going to be with us for a while and we can try different things, but we're never going to eradicate it or something. So if it's a wicked problem, a very difficult one, how can we tell? And then you would say we would be in the lower right quadrant then. If so how can we tell after 9 months that this is working and this is not working? How much time should we give it, or what are we to look for?
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, that's the limit of the analogy with venture capitalism, is that there's no equivalent bottom line. So you can't actually, and also aid is full of brilliant advocates who will always say that a failure is actually just a success waiting to happen. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes it looks like it's a disaster, and then 20 years later suddenly you find you've done some shift. So it's really, there are limits to this. And in the end, all you can go with is judgment. And the judgment is informed by data and evidence, but also experience and political savvy. And that's very unsatisfying for people who want certainty. But what else can you do? You think, I feel that this project has a chance to succeed. And because I've got it right in the past, I've become senior and people will listen to me. You know, it's very unsatisfying if you want something clearer than that. I don't see how you can get any better than that. Do you?
Well, I've also done a little bit of problem-driven iterative adaptation. That's another acronym of this. And I think one other helpful thing is that you make the problem smaller. Yeah. So you kind of see what's behind this, and then you do it step by step, and you see some improvement. So that has also helped me, but I still think it's a tricky issue, especially if you have to be accountable to someone for the money that you've spent.
Well, I think in this phase you do lots of small bets where you can afford to fail, and then only then do you start to scale up and take bigger bets. But that is difficult in terms of project cycles and funding streams and so on. Yeah.
I'd be really curious to hear from some of our colleagues here. Is this back to the 70s? Because that's what I often hear, that this is how we used to do it. Or is there any novelty to this? Who would like to?
I don't think I want to hear the answer.
Yeah. No one? Karl Anders?
A representative from the 1970s, please.
Well, maybe I can elaborate on my own thinking. I worked when I came to work for the field for Sida. It was at the height of the Paris Declaration, so aid effectiveness, 2006, let's say, and to 2010, and I worked in Mozambique on PFM reform. Some people I know from there, and the whole aid effectiveness agenda was really driven by, you know, there is no coordination. No one knows what anyone is doing. The government is just can't cope with all the donors who are trying different initiatives and pushing their own models. So let's get our act together and do a joint thing. And we did a joint thing in many ways, but it was very much up in the right corner. Linear planning, this is how it should be, this is the budget, and this is what you should report to. So I think it was, I mean, it wasn't a success in many cases, and we did a lot of things wrong, but the problem still remains, and the problem of aid effectiveness still remains. So what's your comment or take on that?
Interesting. I mean, you just described we deliberately decided to create a monoculture, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because of the stresses on governments. That, in a different sort of context, that's what Stalin did, right? In terms of markets and economies. Yeah, he got rid of all that annoying duplication of more than one firm producing the same stuff. I mean, isn't that insane? What a waste. Let's just have one firm making shoes. So you can see why there might be limitations to this argument in terms of, I mean, I absolutely understand that the excessive demands on developing country governments because of aid donors coming every 5 minutes or wanting to be babysat and all the rest of it. But maybe the answer is to reduce the demand for babysitting rather than reinvent Stalinism.
Washington consensus. We had something called Washington
absolutely. It wasn't much of a consensus, was it? Anyway, yeah.
So what you're saying is that we should allow for more...
Well, if the problem was donors are demanding too much government time, then demand less government time. But how are you going to get innovation and variety and a sort of interesting system going if by all agreeing to do the same thing? It seemed like the wrong answer to the question. I just made that up just now, but you know, it's a thought.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Svante Sambar. I'm also part of the retired bunch here. I used to work a little bit on Sida, but mainly for different Swedish NGOs, lastly Save the Children. My question is, I'm trying to figure out, if I understand you right, how general is the thinking behind how change happens? Because we are just talking about development situations, basically aid from an aid perspective, no? But looking at societies. But I was wondering, I was thinking for myself, how much of this is applicable to our own societies? Would you say it would be the same book? You could use it if you want to make changes here in Sweden, or and the other question would then be, if you, as a theory, just took away the aid industry from the development world, how would the book kind of understand the society and the change that would occur and happen if you take away the aid business?
So some of the most interesting conversations I've had around the book have been with domestic activists in the UK and the US. So it's not, I think it's not about aid, right? It's about activism. And activism includes everybody from people trying to make change in a multinational company, to people working in the international system, to aid agencies, to my son on the streets of London trying to organise social housing. So I think so unfortunately my experience, which informs the book, makes it look like it's all about aid and development, because that's just what I've done. I wish I had the time to research them, you know, and get examples, but they're clearly there, and a lot of these things do resonate. What would happen if you took away the aid industry? Very little, I fear. You know, change would still happen. People would still get organised. They might find it a bit harder in some circumstances, a bit easier in others. So no, this really isn't, you know, an argument that aid is at the heart of this stuff, and I probably need to make that point more clearly when I'm presenting. The other thing that this just emerged is that aid is fractal, not aid, change is fractal, in that you see the same processes and the same dynamics in that village, in that community in India, that you see at global level. You see critical junctures, you see alliances of unusual suspects, you know, windows of opportunity, what persuades. And actually, that is something I'm claiming in the book, is that you can actually use these ways of understanding systems and how systems change at lots of different levels, because they have some relevance of both micro and macro. So Well, I'll stand by that for the moment until he gets shot down by someone. Yeah.
I can really testify. I've read the book, and I think it's really not about aid. It's more about how change happens in general, and trying to see those patterns. And it could really be about us. When I read it, I was thinking, how do you make change not happen? Maybe that's a good question, actually. If you think that you fear that bad things can happen, what would you do? Do you want to have a take on that?
Yes, no, this is... So I've had 2 suggestions for follow-up books, right? How shit happens, and why change doesn't happen. But this might be a 4th, actually, how to stop bad change happening. The best people to follow, I think, are people like the tobacco lobbyists, right? So there's this famous memo from Rothmans in the 70s saying, which said, doubt is our product, right? So what we're trying to do is sow doubt. It's just what the climate change deniers did, right? So so in the context of Trump, I've been talking to people about how do we stop bad stuff happening, understandably. There's various things which I was talking to Oxfam America about. One is, sow doubt within the minds of the people who are about to do bad things, so that they go somewhere else. Keep your head down and say, go there, go and mess up that. There's various things you can do to do that. I think actually activists are often better at stopping bad things happening than making good things happen. It's a lot easier as a campaign, right? Because my experience of NGO campaigning is that victory is a nightmare. Because whenever you win something, everybody fights. Because half the group will think it's not enough, half the group will think it is enough, and then they start fighting. So on the eve of Jubilee 2000, that big debt relief campaign, just as the big debt relief thing was being agreed, the Jubilee campaign fell apart in acrimony in a castle in Germany and all denounced each other because the one group said it was insufficiently radical and the other group was saying, what are you doing? We've just won. So I think there are some real problems about winning, and stopping bad stuff is often what we do better. That was a bit incoherent. Apologies. It's a long day.
Hi, my name is Bertil Odén. I have one question. Within the aid branch, all over the years, there has been such a huge interest in policies and very low interest in politics. And if you are interested in policies and not in politics, then it's very easy to land into this upper right-hand quarter on this one. I mean, this we had a spell of power analysis during some, was it in the late 1980s, 1990s, in early 1990s in the Swedish aid community. But it faded away one way or another. My question on that is, did you have the same thing in the UK, or is it correct to assume that this reluctance towards discussing aid in terms of politics might be one reason for the difficulties to get into those other quarters in this on this picture you have?
Yeah, absolutely agree. So, the Paris, you mentioned the Paris Agreement, right? So the Paris Agreement had sort of 200 references to partnership and no references to politics, right? I mean, so partnership is the euphemism for lots of other things. So I think there's good reasons for avoiding politics if you're a bilateral donor, right? So it's basically, it draws attention to the fact that you are interfering in the internal affairs of another country, right? Which is what aid does. right? So you can see why. Oh, this is online, isn't it? Oops. But that is, you know, a fair allegation against it. I think there's other reasons why people are unhappy about politics. The good thing about policies is that they're universal. You know, you suggest good policies, you can do them everywhere. Great. So when I did a piece of work on 5 of those countries that have reduced inequality, you know, I was looking at when is the political moment possible for a period of redistribution, and it's things like when there's an external threat, when there's a new political formation which has not yet bedded down, something like the Peasant Party, I think, in Sweden in the 30s, was it?
I wasn't here.
The Peasant Party, I think it was one of the key drivers during the Swedish period of redistribution. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Sorry. Okay. Okay, I'll have to do some reading on that one. Never mind. Just wipe that. I didn't say anything about the Sweden situation. But so a new political party like the PT in Brazil or the MAS in Bolivia, or big conflicts, big fights, you know, the sort of ethnic unrest in Malaysia, those sort of things trigger periods of redistribution. Now, if you're an advocate, you don't like that, because that means in lots of situations, actually, it's very unrealistic to ask for redistribution. And Oxfam didn't really absorb these lessons very easily. You know, didn't want them in its paper because it wanted it to be a universal solution. So there are other reasons. There's risk and being a bilateral donor and your position. But there's also just, I think, the technocratic illusion that, you know, this is a problem which needs to be solved. The passive evasive, Robert Chambers calls it. Yeah? So things need to be done, and people don't want to ask about who does them and why. Yeah. So yes, that's a long way of saying yes.
Richard, making some few comments on some of the questions that were asked, or some of the answers that you provided. I think it was great that we brought up that change is not always for the better. Actually, there can be so-called change agents that are really devilish and are out to destroy all of us. No names named. So I think that's good that it's brought up. You don't refer much to civil resistance studies in your book, but if you had, you would have found some interesting findings about what the best tactic is if you're up against really serious resistance. And it turns out that you should not aim for protecting what you achieved. You should become even more maximalistic. Like, aim for the sky. That's been the tactics of the LGBTIQ movement in the US against all resistance that they face, and they've been quite successful according to sort of research. I think that's a very interesting point, because I think the instinct is that the first thing you think about is that how can we protect our achievements, rather than let's aim even higher and be even bolder and even braver. There was a question about power analysis, and sort of skipping back to my Sida days, I happened to be involved in that, and I kept thinking that it would be great to do a power analysis of the sort of the rise and fall of power analysis. I think my very sort of anecdotal analysis would be that as long as you keep that type of work sort of a bit under the radar in an agency, you can do lots of power analysis, and there's curiosity and a bit of like fear. What are these people doing? But when you formalize it, when you finally get to the point that you can, you know, present a guide or a toolkit, then it dies. That's complete anecdotal evidence, but a power analysis of the rise and fall of power analysis or this approach, I think, would be helpful.
A youth fashion that must be kept edgy and kind of.
I think so, a little bit.
A couple of things on that. One is, I think the British equivalent was probably more political economy analysis, which was much less use. It was we're going to spend millions of pounds on consultants writing enormous papers about the political economy of Nigeria and then put them on a shelf. I think the sort of Goran Haydn in Tanzania, that kind of stuff was probably a bit more useful, to be honest. And so PEA actually gave all this stuff a bad name. And the new attempt is to do something much more relevant and useful to practitioners rather than just a gravy train for consultants. So, the one other thing on resistance, that's interesting you say that. So sort of ramp it up is Donald Trump out of the deal, interestingly. That's his advice. But the other really interesting book is on the resistance by peasants to being overrun by invading cultures, a book called Weapons of the Weak, which you probably read. And I've been thinking about Weapons of the Weak because it's very describes what goes on in NGOs quite well, which is you agree but then don't do anything. You know, dumb insolence, or just pretend not to understand, or lots of these things which are actually very good resistance strategies when something comes at you for a short period and then it'll go away again. There's a really nice paper being discussed tomorrow at the humanitarian conference, ALNAP humanitarian conference, which talks about the ways aid organizations resist things that they don't want to do, because it's looking at changing the humanitarian system. And one of them is to agree with vigor and say, let's do another study on this, which is a classic way to avoid anything happening. Yeah.
But I think the question about incentives in organizations is an important one. Me working at Sida, I think we face a lot of incentives on which aren't really conducive to some of this thinking. And there was a study by Elinor Ostrom, I don't know how many years ago now, 15 maybe, 10? That 15, oh, you were there, which looked at this, and I think it's an important aspect if you want to induce change or
it would be
change.
great to have some more case studies of, because you know we all get impassioned about the latest aid movement, but these have been going on cyclically for decades, and as far as I know, no one's really tried to work out why did cash transfers become a thing when other things just fell away. You know, so to have a sort of discriminating set of histories of different reform movements within the aid business, it might seem a bit self-referential, but I think it would be really interesting and useful.
Yeah, let's make another study.
History, I've got a different place for history, I'll allow history.
Okay, yes.
My name is Jocke Nyberg. I'm an independent evaluator, human rights mainly. I want to ask you about the role of the donor people, not like yourself, like Oxfam, maybe DFID people or Sida or NORAD or the other, in terms of context knowledge. I think you promote the idea that donors as financiers should have sort of deep context knowledge. But I wonder if you see any tendency that the promotion of local ownership goes against that current sort of, referring to Karin's question about the 70s, where Swedish diplomacy and development community in Latin America worked very tight together. High-ranking ambassadors and state secretaries and so on worked with the Latin American people who went to exile, like Ricardo Lagos, Enrique Iglesias. They had very strong context knowledge about the political situation, linking it to the development cooperation in human rights in the 70s and 80s. Do you see any tendency or a risk that donor people at staff at embassies or within DFID really give too much power to the local ownership thing, and they don't really say, you know the knowledge, the context knowledge, and we will not interfere in your analysis? Is that a risk? Do you see any tendency of this?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, you've got a sort of staff turnover, typical staff turnover of about 2 years in DFID. So no DFID person ever knows what they're talking about. Right? And it's not that different in Oxfam. I bumped into our gender advisor from Afghanistan in Dubai airport once, and she said, I've just left after 2 years and I was the longest serving international gender advisor. So you do need to find other sources of wisdom and knowledge if you're going to understand that kind of diagram. So then the art for the aid worker becomes, how do you assess the holders of local knowledge and decide which ones are good and which ones are compromised, which ones have their own agenda. I have no idea how you train people in that, but it's a kind of meso level skill of assessing the value of intelligence. You're never going to have the intelligence yourself, but you have to be able to distinguish when someone's trying to use you and when someone's actually telling you something useful. And that's, I have no idea how you do that, but that clearly is the art. At the moment, they're not even asking. In Afghanistan, we didn't have links to local academics. We didn't have links to People like you know, there ought to be sort of drawdown arrangements with people who've worked on an issue or in a country for 10, 20 years, from the country or even foreign, as a sort of standard thing, you know, a sort of institutional wisdom piece. And it doesn't happen at the moment. People default to processes, guidelines and so on, instead of the local wisdom. And I think that's a huge gap.
I think we will end this interesting conversation. I'll remind everyone that there are a few copies left of the book. It's Swedish 100 kroner. And it's also available open access, as we said. Yeah, you should pay by cash, but I think we can organize Swish as well.
It's much better to read the book.
Absolutely, it's much nicer.
You can write on it. Yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Duncan for being here.